Racist doctor publicly insults black nurse, stunned to discover she's his boss. Early in her 40s, Grace Brooks had always believed in diligence and humility. She carried herself with quiet assurance, the kind that resulted from years of commitment and overcoming many obstacles. Grace was a woman of substance, yet you never knew by her manner in the hospital halls wearing. Today, a nurse was covering for a colleague who was simply filling in for another who was on vacation on tasks she hadn't done often in years, yet this didn't disturb her terror. No duty was beneath her, and she wasn't one to show off titles. She had begun her job as a nurse after spending hard hours sleeplessly through medical school. Evenings and a relentless will derived from her past had molded her into the sympathetic leader she was. A medical director of one of the most esteemed hospitals in the city today. The route had not been simple. Grace grew up in a low-income area surrounded with by few prospects, yet she never let her situation define her. Instead, though her first step was nursing, her dream had always been. Grace's knowledge and commitment were noted as she ascended higher and over time made a difference on a more extensive basis. She was promoted and finally acquired her current position as medical director by those who counted. Despite her status, Tara stayed rooted. She thought that leadership had nothing to do with titles. It was about realizing the difficulties the people under you experienced and the need of knowing them. This is why, even now, she returned today in scrubs, assisting on the floor, since her squad most needed her and knew who she was, and appreciated her for her modesty and willingness to help the hospital itself get through busy times. Was a high-end establishment serving the affluent and powerful, noted for its first-rate TI facilities, modern design, technology, and highly qualified experts, but it also had its shortcomings. The setting was hierarchical, with distinct lines separating doctors from support workers. Nurses, in particular, often encountered many doctors viewed themselves at the receiving end of this inflexible system as superior, not only in title but also in many other aspects. But in value as a culture, Tara had been subtly transforming ever since she became control. Though she knew that among these professionals, altering attitudes takes time. Robert Ellis, middle-aged white, and a man rising through the ranks who had spent his career valued for his medical ability but infamous for his conceit. He had a perfect record with his patients, but his colleagues, particularly the nurses, thought he was intolerable. He treated them. It was not unusual for him to yell orders, with no respect, addressing them as though their sole goal was to serve him. Without even a thank you or a please, his attitude implied he saw nurses underneath him. Respect for Dr. Ellis was something that only rose towards individuals he judged equal or superior in the strict framework of the institution. He had no time for the viewpoints of nurses, and teamwork in his views was just everyone doing what he desired without question. He thought his assessment was always correct. Anyone who challenged him was just not qualified enough to grasp the complications of his choices. Tara knew about Dr. Ellis, but their paths didn't. She had heard complaints from the nurses under her care rather frequently, but she wanted to handle such issues. Her aim was always to change the culture, not people. Nonetheless, she recognized that earlier. Later their paths will intersect, particularly in a place like this where power dynamics were always in action. That day, Dr. Ellis showed up at the hospital in his regular rush, not anticipating anything unusual. His daily schedule was full of procedures, consultations, and what he deemed to be normal stupidity in patient expectation management. He lacked time for delays or errors, particularly not from the hospital staff he regularly observed as too slow to match his pace. As he arrived in the ward where Tara was temporarily posted, he looked about. His eyes hardly registered the personnel in front of him. They were merely nurses. Grace was preoccupied reviewing patient charts and initially missed him. Was concentrated in making sure the patients under her care were in order. Her behavior was peaceful. She was deliberate in her rounds, not knowing that Dr. Ellis had entered the room, and he was about to assume things that would inevitably cause conflict. Dr. Ellis looked around to see her in the room's corner and quickly judged she was simply another nurse. Looking at appearance, he didn't know her, and why would he? In his mind, she was Just another cog in the wheel, another nurse assigned to follow his instructions without question as he strode toward. Her annoyance, already tumbling into his voice, set the scene for a moment neither of them could have predicted. Not comprehending who he was talking to, he started barking commands without thinking twice, and most definitely not conscious of the respect Grace, ever the professional turn, demanded. In the very hospital he felt he dominated. She gently faced him, her demeanor blank, but her eyes possessed a peaceful power absent from Dr. Ellis's work. Acknowledged, but shortly Grace would be preoccupied with her chores, verifying patient charts and making sure everything was ready for the next rounds. Her motions were exact and effective. Considering years of experience, she didn't mind covering for a nurse today. She really embraced it since it allowed her to reconnect with the daily tasks that anchored her in her early years. Years as a nurse, suddenly the sound of fast footfall and a speech laced with. She lost focus as impatience tore through Dr. Robert Ellis's noisy entrance into the room. Grace looked up momentarily to politely nod before he continued. But carried on her job without much fuss. Dr. Ellis neglected to reciprocate the gesture. Rather, he focused right away on Grace's eyes, narrowing as if something about her concerned him from the beginning. You intend to simply stand there all day? Dr. Ellis snapped, his voice sharply and condescending. I need these patient files updated. Could you follow easy? Grace stopped briefly, surprised by his tone, but she rapidly composed herself and looked down at the handheld chart to ensure. Before answering, everything was in order. I am using normal procedure, doctor. Her voice was calm, but Dr. Ellis updated the files soon. His eyes glitched with annoyance, and he waved her off, not interested in explanations. Dismissively, as though her answer would cause me hassle, I cannot afford reasons, he responded, his voice growing louder as this hospital struggles. Enough as it is without staff like you. Slowing down, the other nurses in the room exchanged nervous looks. Grace could see their eyes fixed on her, and the strain in the room grew with every second. Junior doctor, who was nearby, froze, not sure whether to step in or keep out of the path of fire. It was not unusual for Dr. Ellis to criticize the staff, but this was different. Tara felt the sting of his words, not because they were accurate, but rather more personal today. Words were more cutting today. He hadn't even given her an opportunity to demonstrate her competence, given the presumptions underlying them. She believed she was beneath him, yet she still maintained her calm, not allowing his comments to set off a reaction from her. I am working as directed, Dr. Tara said consistently, maintaining her voice steady despite the mounting annoyance inside. I'm making sure that patient care is not affected. Yet, Dr. Ellis was not listening. His voice rose furthermore, loud enough to draw attention from people close by. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he remarked, pointing exaggeratedly toward Tara without any sense of urgency. Given staff like this, it's understandable that things don't go as planned. The weight of his neglect of detail here. Tara stood there, feeling the eyes of the audience on her, but words hung in the air, loaded with accusation. She refused to let her expression shift. She was upset, certainly, but more than that, she was furious, not because he was wrong in any one aspect, but more because he didn't know her qualifications, didn't know her past. He only saw a nurse in front of him and determined that she was the cause of Dr. Ellis's visibly growing irritation. Perhaps this is too much for you, he said, his words dripping with contempt. Maybe you're not suitable. We cannot AFF mistakes in a place like this, not in a hospital of this kind. It was subdued, but Tara sensed it right away. From here, the insinuation sat there just under the surface of his words. He hadn't stated it clearly, but it was there, the presumption that she didn't belong. Someone like her, a black lady wearing a nurse's uniform, would not have said such to another doctor. He was out of place in such a distinguished environment. To a nurse he respected, Grayson understood what he was getting at. She looked about while the other employees stood in awkward silence, their discomfort obvious. They had heard the remark too, but nobody mentioned anything. The quiet was as deafening as the comments of Dr. Hughes, stung almost as strongly. Grace felt a flash of wrath. She choked it back. This was not the time or location she could She could have told him that she was the medical director right then and there, plainly showing her status. Of this particular hospital, she supervised areas much beyond his comprehension, and she possessed more authority than he could have realized, but what good would it do facing him in front of everyone? It wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. It wouldn't change his mindset, and it most definitely wouldn't deal with the hidden prejudices causing events like these. Rather, she inhaled deeply, centering herself, and I'll make sure everything is taken care of. Her voice is subdued. Calm, but strong. Dr. Ellis hardly nodded in response to her words. He had already looked away, too consumed in his own annoyance to see the effects of what he had said. He murmured just to have it done. Grace stayed there for a moment, her hand still gripping the tension he left behind as he hurried off. Patient charts, her mind running, feeling the weight of the event falling on her. She had been embarrassed in front of her co-workers, handled like the she were less than, as though she didn't belong, and it wasn't simply because she was a nurse for the day based on her identity as a black woman standing in a place where Dr. Ellis felt she had no right to be. But Tara was not the kind to let wrath overwhelm her. She wouldn't provide Dr. Ellis the gratification of seeing her disturbed. She would end her duty with the same subdued dignity she had always carried, and when the time came, she would handle this in the correct way, through the appropriate. Grayson turned back to her, knowing her value even though Dr. Ellis did not. Job, she could sense staff members staring at her once more this time, though. Their eyes also reflected a subdued respect. They had seen what had transpired, and although none of anyone had spoken up during the moment, Grace's grace under pressure Dr. Ellis had seen embarrassed her in front of others. Grace had kept her cool, and that was, though it left her with an uncomfortable outcome, something he would never take away from her. DOA ultimately came to an end. Wait, she couldn't ignore. Following her shift, went back to her office, the same office she made important choices in as the hospital's medical director, but today she had felt insignificant. Reduced to a nurse in the view of a guy unsure of her identity, did not care to ask, and had taken liberties he never would have taken. Should have. As she sat at her desk, playing the scene in her head, the sting Hughes' remarks resonated in her ears, every contemptuous remark ringing with a finality she had experienced. Worse in her career, definitely, but this time it was different. It was not the obvious prejudice she had come across in the past or the overt misogyny. It was the subtle, insidious manner Dr. Ellis had simply assumed she was unworthy of respect, therefore the casual disrespect for her as a person that dug deeper than Grace could have imagined. Remembering the long road she had driven, she had worked her way up from a nurse to land her job as a medical practitioner to reach where she was now. Director, of feat requiring years of diligence, resiliency, and sacrifice. Recalled the late evenings spent learning in medical school, the days she was the only black woman in the room, and she had been underappreciated or discounted countless times. It was not new, yet it still hurt. She used her phone to text her good friend and fellow co-worker Janelle. They had gone through so much together, and Grayson needed to speak with someone who would grasp in minutes Janelle's apparent concern in her voice. What occurred today? Janelle inquired, already aware of Tara's irritation. Tara hesitated for a moment. It's Dr. Ellis that chastised me, and Janelle sighed on the other side of the front, treating me like nothing at all. Line, what did Tara tell about the incident? Hugh reported the object of Dr. Words still fresh. I assumed I was inept, discounted me as not knowing what I was doing or even try to pay attention. I explained myself in front of everyone I could see, like I was just some helpless bystander. Janelle, the way the nurses and junior physicians treated me appeared. Grace felt her fury burning for a minute. You didn't tell him? Tara shook her head, though Janelle couldn't see her. No, I didn't believe it would have solved anything. He wouldn't have listened anyhow, and I didn't want to escalate it. It's not about me specifically. Anything larger than one moment. Still, Janelle answered, her voice not from him. Grace, softening. You shouldn't have to cope with it either. Leaned back in her chair. I know, but I have to consider this isn't limited to one occurrence. It also relates to the culture in this location and the treatment of especially minority employees. I'll handle it. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the hospital, the aftermath of the tragedy was already evident. gathering a few of the nurses who had seen the argument in the break room, their voices is modest but full of incredulity. Did you notice what happened with Dr. Ellis and Tara earlier, one of them? Shaking her head in disgust. I couldn't believe the way he treated her as she didn't know what she was doing. I know another nurse mentioned she behaved like a novice who didn't belong here, but she managed it rather well. I'm not sure how she stayed this calm. A senior nurse who had overheard their exchange walked over. She had spent years at the hospital and knew Grace long before she became the medical director. Do you know who Tara truly is? She asked. The younger nurses gazed at her slightly lowered voice. Shek not only a senior nurse, but also shakes her head in perplexity. The medical director of this entire hospital is a nurse. Ellis was talking down to his boss, and the room collapsed without his realizing it. Quiet as the weight of the revelation sank in the startled looks among the nurses, understanding the seriousness of what had just experienced. Grace had gone through that humiliation without speaking, even though Dr. Ellis had already moved on from the episode, blissfully ignorant of the tempest building around him. Chalking it down as another day with employees he thought will require more discipline or training later on. While sipping coffee with a colleague, Dr. Ellis casually related the incident. I had to correct one of the nurses earlier. She was slowing down with a smile. Things down. Some persons simply aren't suited for this kind of work. Others pay no attention to what has to be done. No, his younger colleague, a doctor who only lately started working at the hospital, squirmed uneasily in his seat. He much respected Tara, even though he was not sure what had transpired between her and Dr. Ellis earlier in the day today. Now hearing the casual arrogance in Dr. Ellis' tone, uncertain about how to reply, the younger doctor whispered, trying to escape more discussion on the topic he didn't want to touch on, Hugh's negative side, but he also felt wrong letting the remark slip. I'm sure she was just having an off-peak moment. Dr. Hugh shrugged. Maybe I should still demand more from the personnel here. There is no place for errors in this place. Unseen to Dr. Ellis, whispers had already begun to. Word of Grace's actual situation traveled around the hospital, and as it did, more and more individuals felt a sense of. Grace started to feel uneasy, not one to allow things fester pass by without. She realized that something had to be done, but she was not interested in public vengeance or retaliation. It wasn't only about Dr. Hugh's actions, but also about a structural problem in the hospital culture letting employees to be handled with such disdain. Tara started working on a formal, but it was more about the larger picture she had experienced than about reciting every detail of what had happened to her that day. Explain the need of better respect and communication training, especially amongst doctors and nurses. She aimed at addressing the subtle prejudices that sometimes went unbridled, especially in terms of treatment of minority employees. Not to humiliate Dr. Ellis, but rather to make sure none else had to go through what she had. As she finalized the report, Grayson knew that Dr. Ellis would soon come to see his error. She wasn't intending on direct confrontation with him would handle that. Yet, when the whispers went around and Dr. Ellis began learning more about who Tara actually was, the weight of his deeds would fall upon him, and by then it would be too late to reverse the harm he had done. Tara sat in the boardroom waiting for the conference to. The room was very chilly and hummed quietly with hospital. She felt the weight of what was about to happen as bureaucrats shuffled documents and murmured among themselves down on her, but she was cool under pressure. She understood that today wasn't only regarding handling what had transpired between her and Dr. Ellis. It was about facing a more underlying concern in the. Dr. Ellis entered the hospital with a culture that had let this occurrence to start in the first place. As sure as ever, he nodded quickly to the top hospital management before. Grace, not yet aware of the scope of the conference, he was still in the dark about, so sitting exactly across from her. Tara's actual stance toward him was simply another ordinary conversation topic that would most likely finish with him walking out unharmed as usual. The director of hospital administration, Mr. Thompson, opened the. Dr. Ellis, approaching with a serious tone, we are here to go about an incident that lately happened between you and one of our employees have formally complained about your behavior. We must know your side of the story. Dr. Ellis straightened his chair and spoke with a trace of, "I was merely doing my work. I had to keep the crew in line." Frustration looks like this. Particularly in cases of malfunctioning systems, the nurse in issue was slowing down the flow of events, and I had to act to guarantee that patient care was not compromised. It is not personal. It is about maintaining order. Tara listened silently while he spoke, her hands resting gently in her lap. She had expected this response made it quite evident that Dr. Ellis felt his actions were not only justified, but also required. His tone was defensive, his posture stiff, as though he were challenging everybody in the room to question his power. "Mr. Though." Empson looked at Grace, signifying it was her turn to talk. She looked at Dr. Hugh for a quick. "Just before calling on the room, I realize how crucial it is to keep patient care effective." She started, her voice steady and under control, but that day was more about respect, or more accurately, the lack of it. Dr. Ellis shifted uneasily, but didn't interrupt Grace. "You didn't only fix my behavior. You publicly humiliated me in front of patients and staff. You questioned my qualifications without attempting to find out who I was or what my experience would be, and by doing this you assumed something." Presumptions based on prejudice caused the crowd to quiet as Grace's comments floated around. As Dr. Hughes struggled to make sense of her remarks, for the flutter of doubt crossing his cheeks, he looked unsure. "First time." Grace inhaled deeply and carried on. "What you not knew, Dr. Ellis is the medical director of. I am not only a nurse." There was a fleeting silence in this hospital before Dr. Hughes' eyes opened, his lips as like he were speaking, then rapidly closed it in shock. Normal confidence vanished in an instant, and the room went silent as everyone worked through the weight of what Tara had suddenly replaced the arrogance and superiority that had marked Dr. Hughes' posture minutes ago. "Tara," said her voice, clearly uncomfortable, "and I felt no need to rebuke you before the staff that day. Never rising, never wavering. I might have, but that wasn't the point. The problem here is not about who owns what. Rather, it is about how we treat one another in this hospital, especially in terms of race and hierarchy. Your behavior was contemptuous rather than merely unprofessional, because it revealed a more general issue transcending this one episode that Dr. Ellis was obviously caught under." His face reddened with shame as he looked at the hospital administration for support, but he searched for none. He stammered somewhat as he talked. "Though I wasn't sure who you were, I realized I meant not knowing." Trying to be Mr. Thompson, he leaned forward slightly, and his voice sliced across the awkwardness. "Dr. Ellis, this relates to the more than just a misinterpretation. It relates to the culture of how employees are handled here. What happened cannot be discounted so readily." Dr. Ellis became quiet. The weight, the circumstances were setting in, and he was obviously trying to save face. At last he let out a shaky breathing. His voice is quieter now. "I perceive no more of the former bravado. I'm sorry for treating you, Dr. Brooks. I made a mistake. Not meant to disrespect you, but now I see that my behavior was improper." The apologies hung in the Terry gazed at him, uncomfortable and stopping. Her expression was blank, but she could see he seemed uncomfortable, struggling to own his mistakes. She was not seeking personal vindication. She was looking for change. "I value your apologies." Her voice was cool and measured, "yet this relates more to our hospital's future than to myself. We have to confront the prejudices that let this occur. This is a chance for every one of us to consider how we respect one another independent of rank or background." Mr. Thompson spoke out, addressing the room, and hospital executives nodded in unison. "We treat this event seriously and will be thoroughly reviewing our policies and personnel performance internally. We will also be enforcing required bias training and bolstering a professionalism and respect culture." Grace felt comfort across all staff levels when she heard those comments. This was more about making sure the hospital followed the required procedures to produce than about penalizing Dr. Ellis. More friendly and welcoming surroundings for everyone she hadn't wished to degrade or exact retribution on. And now she was comforted knowing that this could bring about actual change. When the conference came to end, Dr. Ellis stood still, plainly disturbed by what had happened. He turned back to Tara once again. his voice almost above a whisper once more. "I'm sorry. I'll do better, Grace." Nodded, her look indifferent, knowing only time would reveal if his. Although an apology would mean actual action, for now she had done what she came to do and had stood her ground using. She had left the conference using this opportunity to advocate for the required systematic change based on grace and dignity. Grace had closure. She hadn't escalated the conflict, but she also hadn't let it slip. She had held Dr. Ellis responsible not by shredding him down, yet by keeping him and the hospital up to a larger degree. The actual effort was only starting, but Grayson understood that the improvements at the hospital were headed in the correct path. Apparent and obvious. Few days following the conference, an official announcement was developed by senior management concerning the diversity of the new policies under execution. From the top-ranking doctors to the lowest staff, Tara participated actively in training sessions mandated for every staff member. Helped to shape these changes, ensuring that the training courses transcended mere surface-level dialogues and solved the more fundamental problems of racial inequalities and power dynamics that tormented the company. She recognized that what had occurred between her and Dr. Ellis, it was not a one-off occurrence, but rather a more general issue inside the. She was resolved to utilize her position to ensure that none else would have to go through what she had. The culture of the hospital. The personnel, particularly those who had watched the occurrence, regard Tara with a fresh respect for nursing. Silently absorbed the verbal assaults without disclosing her own identity, now known as Grace's power. Discussions among staff members in the break rooms also shifted as they freely shared how the institution must treat everyone with more respect independent of position or color. Was now about creating a friendly workplace where everyone felt appreciated. Grace, not about hierarchy, came to represent the transformation of a leader who used her authority to elevate people rather than flaunting it. Dr. Ellis, on the other hand, had his own metamorphosis, first apologizing to Grace had been formal and rigid, more in response to the strain he was under than in a true show of regret. But as the days went by and he started to consider what had happened, the shame of learning about the actual posture of panic hit him hard. But it was more than that. He began to see the trends of his conduct, not just with Tara, but with. Over the years, other nurses and junior staff would always have seen him as someone who wanted excellence, but today, he saw how occasionally his attitude had been hurtful, even poisonous. Dr. Ellis began going to the diversity training courses with a different perspective than what he used to see as a box to check off. Rather, he paid close attention to the perspectives of staff members. He had never taken the time to really listen until he started to question not only his behavior, but also the culture that had allowed him to operate in that manner for so long. In one especially significant session, Dr. Ellis got up and shared his own experience with Grace. He shared with the group on how his presumptions had resulted in unfair treatment of her and how he was trying to modify such behavior. His sensitivity shocked many, yet it also gained him respect. It was not an easy, but Ellis tried to restore confidence. Along with his colleagues, especially the nurses, he started instructing younger doctors on the value of, with cooperation and respect for every medical staff member outside of the building. The narrative of Tara's experience started to convey knowledge of the improvements occurring at the hospital to other establishments, resulting in talks about racial and gender prejudices in workplaces. Other hospitals, especially those with similar hierarchical systems, started consulting Tara for guidance on carrying out their own changes. The medical professionals who were generally opposed to change began to see how one event had set off significant talks on power relations and inequality. Soon brought Grace invitations to share her experience, not only as a personal narrative of overcoming injustice, but also as a case study at multiple conferences. Research in how individual acts she discussed could set the stage for systematic transformation. Medical schools, leadership summits, and diversity and inclusion panels stressing the need of empathy, open-mindedness, and responsibility at all levels of the healthcare system. Grace showed no ambition in fame, yet she realized the need of leveraging her position to promote more general improvements that would benefit everyone, particularly included her quiet moments. Tara's underprivileged workforce members would consider the arduous route that had led them to This point, she remembered the early years of her profession, when she had encountered several challenges, usually feeling like growing up she had never worked twice as hard to be seen as half as good. Imagined herself in a position of such authority, but via pure will and the encouragement of her family and mentors, she had developed to be a medical director. Currently she was in a role to implement the very improvements she had hoped for in her earlier years, a more fair, inclusive workplace where people were judging based more on their skills than on their skin tone or hierarchical level. Grace often spoke these thoughts with her close friends and relatives one evening while seated with her spouse and kids. Two kids, she said how appreciative she was of the chance to change things. I never asked to be in the, she said gently, then if this experience might benefit others, it was worth it. Her spouse grinned and gripped her hand to change things to people. Grace was not concerned in personal glory, or listening to you. She was pleased with what she had done, though. She had turned a humiliating, nasty event into a spur for she hoped, since genuine lasting change comes from the hospital being a better place. Worried the dialogue she avoided would keep rippling outward, motivating other establishments to adopt suit. In the months following, the hospital's modifications started to take hold. The staff members started attending regular training courses, and the hospital administration made a point of advocating more varied and inclusive leadership styles for junior nurses, doctors, and even cleaning staff members said the experience with Dr. Ellis made them more appreciated and valuable. Became ingrained in the hospital's past as a reminder of their progress and the still-to-be effort required. As Grace stayed modest and kept on her work both in the hospital and within the larger medical community. She is seeking attention for herself, but constantly keeps her eye on the current task to establish a workplace free of everyone no matter their ethnicity or viewpoint was handled with humility and respect. She knew the road was far from finished, but Grace was resolved to see it through to the end. Her narrative wasn't only for her, it was about a profession, a community, and a hospital that had been compelled to face its own prejudices and flaws. And even if a lot of work still has to be done, Grace's calm strength and relentless dedication to justice helped the future seem brighter. Disclaimer: this channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.